white zone is for immediate...
Wait a minute. Have you heard?
This is a show to keep you on the edge of your seat.
Citizens of America,
Welcome to the Radiocast.
Hello, folks, and welcome to the first Radiocast. This is kind of a lead-off episode for us, but it's following the old-time movie and the old-time TV show that a bunch of the guys at ECAT wanted to bring back. It's an original show that went up until 2018 that was hosted by George Farrell, who retired, and the show kind of got left behind. So we wanted to bring it back, and the show is really any movie or TV series that kind of got let go to archives and public domain. We're able to broadcast it, so we're each taking a turn hosting the show and bringing certain episodes or certain movies that we liked and trying to showcase it into the public. And this podcast is really just to go deeper dive, if you want to say, to showcase that movie or TV show. So today, this show, actually, this podcast, you'll see multiple faces all around ECAT. You kind of know some of our faces, kind of heard some of our voices going through the channels. But now you kind of see a face and kind of put name to the face of the ECAT. So today I'm hosting this episode for our Radiocast. Adam Carreiro, you probably heard my voice on Easton News weather and sometimes on some of the sportscasts. In today's episode, we have Ben Bradford. I kind of not heard his voice, but you kind of saw his hands, little hand model action for the intro for The Love of Words. But he's also one of our producers, videographers, editors. And if you watch the first episode of Old Time Movie, the host of this first episode. And also with us, we have Jack Kelleher. And Jack hasn't really put his face and his voice on the channel, but he has produced, he has edited, he's the kind of the Jack of all trades behind the scenes for ECAT.
Oh, there's a few Jacks here. So.
There'll be a few Jacks, a few Joes that we'll see circling this. This podcast is probably one that we'll see really quick rotation between each episode. But we all took a turn hosting either the old time movie or the old time TV show. So we kind of didn't want to make a long episode of that, doing an intro, outro discussion. So we figured, why not a podcast to go into the mix of the show that we're bringing back. So the first movie was M, that was made in 1931. So we're bringing back an old one, but it's rated one of the top movies in history by a lot of critics. So we'll kick it to Ben, the host of the first episode, to tell us a little more about the movie M.
Yeah, so I think the best place to start would be kind of why we chose this movie to open the show on. I think it's most well known for being one of the first sound films to come out of Germany. Director Fritz Lang was known for a lot of his silent films in the German Expressionist movement, most notably Metropolis, which we almost did as our first episode, but it's a little strange, so we wanted to ease people in with something a little more recognizable, a little more in line with modern tastes, and I think this is a good middle ground because it's an early sound film. There's a lot of elements that are used in modern films today. It's one of the first movies about a serial killer. It's one of the first police procedurals, maybe the first police procedural, actually, which we can talk about later. But it's a lot of, and then it's referenced a lot in a lot of movies. People, like nowadays, Silence of the Lambs takes a lot from it. A lot of movies like that. So we thought it would be interesting to show people where a lot of more modern movies they like kind of came from and was influenced by.
Yeah, and there was a lot of scenes too. Watching it, you could see resemblance of like other movies. Like it was a serial killer movie, but just the whole bank robbery scheme that was in the mixture, I was like, oh, this is kind of like Ocean's 11 right now. Like everybody had a deal and it was going through, and they're like, this is a perfect time to go for a bank robbery. Everybody's looking for a killer. Let's go rob this bank.
Oh, yeah, fun fact about that. I was reading that the whole sequence of them breaking into the building and like breaking all the doors open, knocking out the guards, that it was actually based on a real life robbery that happened in Germany before the movie was made. Though then they were actually trying to steal stuff, not searching for a serial killer.
Yeah, and it was like once they heard like the little stuff in the attic and really wanted to go find the person, he's like, oh, he's up in the attic, and they're like, oh, the alarm's going off. No one was like, oh, let's try to get in the safe. It's like, no, we're gonna find this guy. And totally just dropped all the money and forgot the one safe breaker in the bottom floor.
Yeah, the guy who drills through, which I don't know, that reminded me a lot of the Michael Mann movie Thief.
Okay,
you guys have ever seen that? Like
yeah.
a lot, like the scene where they're welding through the safe at the climax of that movie. So yeah, there's a lot, like, it's a very influential film. Like a lot of people, even like people that, you know, like Kurosawa was really influenced by this movie. Noir films like definitely take a lot from this, which is interesting because the star of this movie, Peter Lorre,
I believe.
Yeah, Peter Lorre. He ended up starring in The Maltese Falcon as the bad guy in that movie, which is really what kicked off noir as like a genre in America. And then the director of this, Fritz Lang, would go on to do. Did he do The Big Sleep or the Big Heat?
Big Heat. I
Yeah,
believe.
he did The Big Heat, which is a pretty famous and influential like noir film. So, you know, this indirectly leads to a lot of classic American movies as well.
And just some of the shots they took too, like instead of just trying to find, like in the beginning when the mom's looking down the whole like hallway of all the stairs, and you think it's like, oh, they just put the camera down and they're like looking at it, I was like, that's not even a real staircase, that's a model.
Yeah, it's
Like-
like a matte painting or something. Yeah,
Like I looked down, like, wait, I was like, that's like so easy kind of shot to find, and they were just like, nah, we're just gonna make it our own so we get it right.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, speaking of shots that appear in other movies, just like two, I think of the most, like two very recent movies that I can think of that seem to borrow elements or shots in this movie. One of them was Joker, the Joaquin Phoenix movie 2019, because in M there's a scene where I believe it's like I wrote down, it's like 15 minutes into the movie while the cops are talking about the killer. It briefly cuts to Peter Lorre, and he's looking at himself in a mirror and using his fingers, and apologies to anyone who can't see this on the podcast, uses his fingers to like twist his smile and like warp like the edge of his smile. And if you've seen the 2019 Joker movie, he does that all the time in the movie, usually in front of a mirror. So that just seemed like that was one shot. So I saw that in M. I was wondering if that was an homage to it in Joker. Another thing that was mentioned by Fritz Lang is this is a film about a child serial killer. So, and the film, it doesn't show any of the killings, but there's a quote by Fritz Lang where he said that he wanted to intentionally do that because he felt that like if he left it up to the audience's imagination of just what the killer did, that would be scarier than anything he could show on screen. And a recent movie that kind of did the same thing was, I don't know if you saw a recent horror film called The Black Phone. It starred Ethan Hawke. It's also a movie about a child serial killer, and that film also doesn't show any of the actual killings. It more like leaves it up to your imagination of what exactly happened to these children. And just you trying to imagine it, it's probably like scarier than anything the movie could have shown. So those are like two recent films I can think of that like are still to this day are borrowing elements from M.
Yeah, and I read that like a lot of people when he was making this was really nervous about that, like not showing the kids and everything else. So that was probably like a deep kind of obstacle that he probably would have to get around. Definitely back then when movies are just starting to come up. Like now there's so many different types of movies that people just go see and not decide not to watch it. But back then it's like when a movie came out, that was like the thing to go see.
Yeah, especially in 1931 where there was not really television, it was just radio, movies, plays. So there wasn't a whole lot of options. So if you went to see, if there was a movie out, usually you went to go see it.
Yeah, and you can definitely tell it's like the early when there's like dead silence because they had no audio, and like you read up why they couldn't do all the audio.
Yeah, so audio tape was a pretty recent invention at the time. In Germany, it was actually, interestingly enough, it was developed in part by the Nazi Party, or in collaboration with them and the German branch of IBM. Which the reason they did that is they were trying to broadcast Hitler's speeches at a more record and play back his speeches at a better quality, so people thought he was giving live addresses constantly, when really they were just pre-recording and playing them as if he was giving the same speech in the same way over and over and over again. So it was, because of that, it was very, very expensive to rent the sound equipment needed to record sound. So Fritz Lang made a choice to, I think it was about 2/3 of the movie is with sound, and then 1/3 is silent, which is interesting because he actually... movies only became 24 frames a second in order to allow sound to work, because prior to that they were shot at 18 frames a second. But when they got sound, they realized that playing back the sound with that frame rate just didn't match up right, so they had to extend it to the 24 frames a second, because that was the minimum amount of frames needed to sync up dialogue correctly. But there's a few shots in this movie, the silent ones, where they're playing it back at that higher speed. When they're going into that building to rob the place, they're playing it at I think it's even higher than 18. They're playing it at fast motion.
You can definitely tell when after the guy got the letter M on the shoulder and he goes into the first floor of the bank, one of the guys, you can tell the way he's running. I was like, oh, they speed up that section. But there's some scenes that ooh, this is kind of dragging out. They could have speeded up or cut it shorter.
Yeah.
But again, it's the early movies, so it's not one of those things that directors are really looking to be all right, how can we make this speed up? It's more all right, we need this shot to establish A and B in the storyline to make it flow.
Yeah. And I think another thing that kind of rises out of that, transitioning into sound, is the way the performances go. A lot of the performances are very, very over the top, which in silent films you had to do because all the dialogue was on just this title card that had absolutely no emotion to it. So you'd kind of overact and then you'd have the dialogue show. But now you can hear the dialogue, so it's kind of an interesting creative choice. And I think it works really well, especially with Peter Lorre, how over the top he is, especially when he's alone. And then when he's interacting with people, he's a little more normal. But when he's in the mirror doing the thing with his face, and then he does a similar thing later when he's looking through the shop window, which I think is the best sequence in the movie.
Yeah, for that to have no audio, you're kind of just in his head.
Yeah, it's you're on the street and there's the sound of the cars and there's, it sounds very realistic, and then you cut to him looking at himself in the mirror and there's no sound. And I feel like that's a really effective technique that you couldn't do today. Sound has become so ingrained in filmmaking that you can't have a scene with absolutely no sound. You need
if not, there's music. If it's not a background,
there's
sound.
Music, or there's a tone. What's the movie, Jake LaMotta movie, Raging Bull? How they have the underwater kind of tone. You have something like that, but I feel like the silence is so bleak and so empty that it really puts you in a space that no other serial killer movie has done for me. Just that silences in those moments are pretty scary.
Yeah, one moment that stood out to me where there was just no sound. A moment that really stood out to me was at the end is when the criminals have caught the killer and then they hold the mock trial in the basement of that factory. The first time Peter Lorre's character turns around and just sees the crowd of dozens, if not hundreds of people who are just staring at him. The camera pans over them slowly and there's just no sound. I found that moment to just be very effective of him being oh crap, I'm screwed.
Yeah, and it's I don't know. I have this opinion, maybe it's a little controversial, but I feel like movies might have gotten sound a little too quick. I think because there was a lot in silent films in that time period. There was a lot of visual experimentation, and then I feel like you got sound relatively early on in film history, and then things, they all had to shift towards realism because you have sound, you have people talking, so it has to be realistic on some level, and I feel like they missed a stage of development a little bit.
Yeah, and it's kind of like that with every technology, because when like CGI started coming into things, people were like, oh, well, you can do this now. It's like, all right, let's do, and they get like the biggest like stunts or the biggest effects, and you're like, that doesn't look good. All right, it doesn't like fit right, and it just keeps going up. So it's kind of like that with, it's like in some of the technology that comes out now, it's like, you don't need like IMAX shooting in that, like, yeah, right. So there's movies that like come out, it's like, no, that really works in some movies. Well, like, not every movie needs like an IMAX feel, but like some movies does. It's just like once a new technology comes out, everybody's like, this is the new thing, this is what it is. It's like, no, it just kind of needs to fit. And sound was kind of the same thing, because now it's like, oh, well, we can do more with sound, we can show more, and we don't need seconds of slides killed for people to read the
dialogue.
The dialogue, right?
Yeah.
So, and I think it's just that it didn't, like, people took it and ran with it instead of trying to solely experiment. But there are some movies that really use the audio to its key of doing it.
Yeah. I feel like it's, I'm a big Altman guy. And I feel like he has disciples now. Like, I feel like Paul Thomas Anderson does a lot of interesting stuff with sound. The Safdie brothers, they did Uncut Gems with Adam Sandler.
Yeah.
A lot of really interesting, like, the movie The Social Network, just ways of making audio just really interesting in a way that a lot of movies don't.
Which a Social Network uses the song that he whistles.
Yes, they do. I didn't make that connection, yeah.
Because I heard that song and I was like, I've never heard this in, like, a serious. It's always, like, a comedy, like cartoons. And I looked it up to see what other movies, and I'm like, oh, yeah, there was a lot of comedies. But Social Networks is the one, like, drama, suspense kind of way they use that song. Was it the Mountain King?
Yeah, it's like the Hall of the Mountain King.
The Hall of the Mountain King, yeah.
And speaking of that song, and like you mentioned experimenting with sound, like this movie in terms of like movie sound did a lot of experimenting and a lot of firsts. Like it was the first film to have like voiceover narration, I believe, because there are a lot of scenes where it just like showing things happening while like someone speaking off camera, narrating, talking about what's happening, like especially like when like I believe the chief of police is explaining to the mayor of the town why they haven't found the killer yet. He's talking about all the methods that they're employing and is showing it while he's speaking. And I believe this was the first film to actually use voiceover narration like that. And going back to the song, this movie does not have a musical soundtrack except for the song that he whistles. And I believe it was I hope I'm pronouncing this right. This was the first time a leitmotif was used in the film.
Yeah, leitmotif, yeah.
And for those who don't know, that is a short recurring musical phrase that when it's used is meant to be associated with a particular person, place, or idea. I think another example would be like like from the movie Jaws, the theme that always plays when, like there's the famous shark theme that always plays when the shark is nearby. The Hall of the Mountain King is always whistled when the killer is nearby. He always whistles it kind of when he's on the prowl.
Whenever he sees a kid, he's like starts whistling that, and then he starts following them.
Yeah, like so like it tells the audience like, yeah, he's on the hunt, he's on the prowl. So it helps to tell the story by informing you like what's happening.
Which I was kind of found weird that the blind guy, like, oh, this is the guy. And it's like, he just didn't whistle. Like, when he's in front of, like, the group, like, he just felt the shoulders, like, oh, yeah, this is the guy. Here's the balloon. And instead of be like, whistle the song. And, like, instead of making him whistle that song to know that was him, they just went along with it.
Well, I think there's kind of a running theme in the movie of this sort of the paranoia that's running through these people. And, like, I think a big part of the movie, especially the middle section, is it's following the police really heavily and like their kind of crackdown and like they talk a lot about how the police are kind of pushing on the civil liberties of the people in this town in order to catch the killer, and there's a lot of discussion of that.
Yeah.
And I feel like that, that's an interesting element that we have. And one thing about this movie that's interesting, this was made in 1931. The Nazis come to power in 1933, and this was one of the first films they banned from the country.
Yeah. And Fritz Lang himself was Jewish, and so was the star Peter Lorre. So a lot of historians have wondered if, like, the paranoia, like, tension, because, like, in the beginning of the movie, we see, like, a lot of, like, neighbors turning on each other, people just accusing each other in the street of being the killer. Like, I think, like, the first scene is, like, a like, small old man just walking through the road. A child walks up and asks him what the time is. He answers. And everyone in the street just sees this guy talking to a child and immediately accuses him of being the killer. So we see, like, a lot of paranoia, a lot of mistrust in authority. So I wonder if, like, because Fritz Lang was Jewish himself and actually his wife would later join the Nazi party.
Right, yeah.
And he would flee Germany in order to escape Nazis. So I wonder if, like, the social paranoia was impacted by him, like, Fritz Lang just seeing the rise of the Nazi party.
Possibly that time. Like, and I think it could happen, like, anytime. Like, it kind of happens, like, around now. The whole thing, like, once you get to, like, with elections, like, what side of the aisle you on, and when the whole COVID shot came out, and they're like, who got vaccinated, who not, and you kind of see that movie, and you kind of see, like, all right, yeah, it could happen any time if public really got pushed in one direction.
Mm-hmm.
How the outcry can happen and just be like mass anarchy.
Yeah, well, one interesting thing about Fritz Lang and the Nazi Party, and this is a really strange thing that doesn't quite make sense to me. He was offered what they called honorary Aryanship by the party to let him stay in the country. So they offered to, like, wipe clean his record of being Jewish as, like, an official party policy, so he'd make propaganda movies for them. He obviously said no. He fled to America, had a career here, but it's just a very strange detail of history that, like, they would do that.
Well, probably because he knew how to make it. Like, back then, it's not something like nowadays, like, oh yeah, there's programs that you can edit in that. Back then, you probably really had to know how to use all the techniques and the tools to really showcase, and he knew, like, how to really portray a direction. So they probably wanted, for propaganda stuff, they probably wanted somebody that knew how to shoot and how to edit to portray that message. And back then, movies being so new, there wasn't a lot.
Yeah.
Be different than somebody trying to, like, grab a hammer and work in a factory, because back then everybody worked in the factory. Nowadays, everybody can open up a computer and edit a program slowly.
Oh yeah, and I mean, even just making a movie back then, how sensitive the film was. Like, you needed so much light to make a movie. It's insane. And then, kind of going into the making of this movie, Fritz Lang was notoriously a very abusive director. He was not fun to work with. The scene when Peter Lorre gets pushed down the stairs, when he's, like, trying to escape the trial and they, like, drag him down the stairs, he was actually falling down the stairs, and they shot that 50 times. So the director had him thrown down the stairs 50 times. And like 20 years later, he asked Peter Lorre, when they were both in Hollywood, to work with him again. Peter Lorre was like, absolutely not. I'm never working with you again in my life.
Yeah, Fritz Lang was notorious for not being... His sets were not very safe, because we mentioned Metropolis. When I was, like, researching Metropolis, because, as you said, we were considering using that for the first episode, I'm amazed that no one died on the set of Metropolis, because there was a lot of safety hazards there.
They almost set a woman on fire, like...
Yeah, and again, it was more like, all right, they didn't really know, like, how to shoot that a certain way to have it look good. So it's like, well, the only way to shoot this, we actually got to do it. Like, no, we can't shoot it one way and then overframe it with a mannequin or a dummy letting on fire. No, we actually got to let her on fire.
Yeah, it's definitely, I think, a testament to just, like, how far the film industry has come in terms of, like, safety. Well, we're still seeing today there's still occasionally accidents and fatalities on film sets, but like just in like early filmmaking, the director just did whatever he wanted and didn't care who got hurt. But
Yeah.
like now there's like so much like regulation and safety and guidelines, where back then there really wasn't anything.
Yeah, no, you got to get a guy jump off the building now. You get the harness. We can we can use a computer program to get rid of the harness so you won't see it.
Mm-hmm.
You'll land safely. You're like, no, you got to jump in. We'll put a pad on the bottom, but you might not last.
Yeah, I mean,
Just
like,
tuck and roll.
yeah, I mean, it also, like, different industries have different things. So like I know in America, and like I can't remember the movie. It's a Charlie Chaplin movie. It's the one they play in the Joker movie, but he's roller skating on the side of a building.
I think it's called Hard Times.
Yes, it is Hard Times, and he's roller skating on the edge of the building. And what they were able to do is they basically shot like a plate, basically, and they just would like cut the film so that the plate was like framed up with the actual shot that they were taking, and then like, but that was like in the later 30s, 40s, like Citizen Kane used that a lot. But like, yeah, that was like, it's crazy how, you know, the technology like develops like that, because like the idea of like opticals and like double exposure, you know, shooting film twice so that it like
it overplays it. Yeah.
Yeah.
And you kind of saw the little extra exposing, like some scenes. I think it must have been on a set, but you can tell the skyline to make it dark. You can tell it was like the negative being burnt, because you can see the edging of the burning of the negative.
Yeah. It's you know, and that's why I think it's interesting to watch these older movies and go over them the way that we're trying to do, because a lot of things now that seem very normal and very natural and just like, you know, just the way movies are made, they were experimental at one time.
Yeah.
Like the idea of having a voiceover narration, that was an experiment. It was an experiment to have people talking and have their words come out of their mouth, you know. And it's interesting to track how these kind of experiments became what we know as movies today. I think that's kind of the value of this show.
Yeah, because there's a lot of kind of backtracking a little to sound and experimentation. There's a lot of moments in the movie where we don't see things happening, we just hear them off screen. Like when the police are starting to crack down on the criminal elements because they want to find the killer, we're just like inside this bar where all like these criminal people are, and we just hear the police whistles outside, and we hear like the screaming and shouting to let them know the police are coming. And later in the movie, when Peter Lorre's killer is hiding, the camera just focuses on him like tucked away in this corner. We just hear in the background like doors being smashed in, people shouting, and they're getting slowly closer and closer to him until finally they get him. And this film definitely was experimenting with like how it can use sound to tell the story without having to show what's happening. Because like, speaking of that, like for like the beginning of the movie, we don't even really see Peter Lorre that much. Like when we first see him, it's just his shadow, and we hear his voice off camera. So it definitely helps to tell his story using sound.
And you know, the use of shadows and light and shadow is really interesting, because you know, Fritz Lang is coming from Expressionism, which had very, very exaggerated like lights and shadows, and like, you know, if you go to like Cabinet of Dr. Caligari or Nosferatu, like, you know, the shadows are so jagged and like the hard light, and like it's creating like this really deep sense of unrealism. And this film kind of takes that kind of lighting, but then kind of introduces it into a much more realistic setting, and kind of like makes it feel real while keeping the same emotional tone of like those more surreal earlier films, which is, you know, it would eventually become, they would get translated into noir as like the kind of lighting that those movies would use. And then it's still popular today in a lot of crime and thriller movies, that style of lighting.
Yeah, and he also did like a lot of shots to transition into like the next scene, either zooming in, or one that was really kind of interesting that he did. I don't think it was a butcher. When they were counting the bread, he has sausages. That's why I'm like, it's a butcher.
Mhm.
And he goes to the whiteboard and he starts changing the prices. And they pan up to like the ceiling of the building, but then it goes to the window of where they're signing up to be watch on what street to watch out for the kids and the killer. And just it was just like one fluid motion to transition from like one location to another.
Yeah, and then like the camera moves forward through the mirror into the
Yeah.
room and begins like traveling across the room, looking at everyone. And I was rewatching that scene, and it's kind of a blink and you miss it moment. But as like the camera gets to the window, you can see them like pulling the window open. It's kind of like a blink and you miss it moment, but
Yeah.
like that's how they were able to like pull off that shot.
Yeah. So it was just like one fluid motion of a camera and just them splicing the film because it's not easier like nowadays. So they really had to sit there and splice it just right for it and reconnect the film for it to play so it goes right in that flow of motion. But like back then it was just jump cuts. So it was like one of the first movies really to do transitions.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that's why it's a good one to show, because it's like you can see the modern sensibilities start to form. Because earlier it was a little ramshackle. It was just like, all right, here's this scene, they just go together. You put them. This scene
Right.
leads to this scene, and then he was thinking like, how does this flow?
Yeah, like speaking of that, this movie does a lot of cross-cutting, like between different scenes that are connected. Because going back to the opening, like the beginning of this movie is a woman, a mom, like setting the table ready for her little girl who's coming back from school, and we cut back, and the film keeps cutting between her and the little girl Elsie, and Elsie eventually encounters the killer, who I believe his name is Hans Beckert, is the name of the character.
Yes.
Like she encounters Hans, and then it keeps cutting back to the mom as you see the mom's getting more and more nervous of like, why isn't my daughter showing up? And then it cuts back to, we see the killer buying her a balloon, and then it cuts back to the mom, and she starts crying out for her daughter. It cuts back, and we just see the girl's ball all by itself. And then later in the movie is like when the criminals decide they're going to start hunting the killer. That scene is contrasted with the scene of the police, basically of them just discussing like how they're going to catch the killer. And there's like a lot of like overlapping dialogue. There's a lot of like cross-cutting.
Yeah. Yeah, going back and forth and then planning everything going through, like how they were going to catch the person and kind of use the I don't know what they call them, but basically like the drifters, kind of like the peddlers.
The beggars.
The beggars, yeah.
Which
I
is
forget what they
apparently
call
a
it.
real thing. It was a real thing at the time. They had a union of beggars who were like an organized group in Germany at the time, which is, I mean, Weimar era Germany had it was not a very rich society, so it does make sense that there would be a lot of beggars and they'd be organized in some sort
during
of way.
that time era. Yeah.
And actually and also the group of criminals were themselves based on a real life organization, because like in the movie, basically all like the criminal leaders of the city meet up and say, hey, all our businesses are being affected. We need to work together to solve this. And like that was based on like a real group of criminals in Weimar Republic, Germany, where like all like these different facets of criminality were all kind of basically working together.
Yeah.
And I wrote down the name of the group, but I would probably butcher the pronunciation of it if I tried to say it.
But yeah, it's kind of like that with like if you go later in the history with like the mobs and that, like mob families working together because the police are cracking down. So it'll be the same kind of thing. Like you just join up against each other, but when you got a common enemy and it's hurting business, kind of join hands and work together.
Yeah, that's something I also want to touch about is kind of like the moral ambiguity of this film, because I was talking about like it contrasts between the police and the criminal organizations who are both trying to catch this killer, but they're kind of both doing it for different reasons. The police, of course, are trying to uphold the law, and the criminals are only really doing it because their businesses are being affected. They don't really seem to. Well, of course they act disgusted by these crimes because it's a child killer. That's the worst kind of crime there is. But the main reason they get involved is because their businesses are being affected. It's not like they doing this for any great noble reason.
No, and even when they get him into that room and they start discussing like what to do, and the lawyer was like, "Oh, you can't kill him," or like right away, and there's people in the room just like, "Oh, well, we got to ask the family." It's like, "Oh, you guys captured this guy, held a court, but you have none of the family members there to judge it." It's like, "Oh, you guys were going to be judge and jury already, and like the people already been caused harm from it are not even in the room to voice their opinion."
Yeah, and the film does end on that note with I think that was the mother from the beginning.
Yeah,
was in
the
last
one that
shot.
talks it. Yeah,
And her line about we need to look out for the children. That is I think kind of who Ling emphasizes. I can't say it. Empathizes with the most. Is the victims and the mothers, but it's interesting how like it feels like he views the police and the criminals kind of in a similarly cold fashion. Like they're both kind of just operating, doing their jobs, and the scene when you're cutting between the two of them, I feel like that's meant to show almost they're parallel. They're like both these organizations within society, and the killer is this element that doesn't fit. He's like an outside element, and that's what's kind of interesting about the movies. The murderer is kind of the protagonist in some sort of way. I don't know if this film has like a traditional protagonist, but he's kind of the only individual who's like acting. Everyone else is a part of a larger organization. So I think that's kind of an interesting construction for a movie, and like not one that's been repeated much since.
Yeah, and it shows like at the end they all go at the same target basically, because it shows them when they're doing the heist. Like, all right, they're doing this big heist, breaking the bank vault, and then all of a sudden it's like, no, the murderer's upstairs. All right, forget about the money. Why we came here, and they just switch and go to that.
Yeah, it's I think there's, like Jack said, there's a lot of moral ambiguity in this.
Yeah.
I think there's a lot of there's a good amount of like there's like the scene when the police raid the bar, which I think is like they're asking for people's papers and they arrest anyone who doesn't have papers. And I think the movie is, and the reason it was banned by the Nazis is the movie is sort of open-ended and questions like how much power should the police have, even in extraordinary circumstances. Like, what rights do civilians have against the police? It's, and the movie doesn't answer any of them. It stays very open-ended, but I think it asks questions that like are still pretty bold to ask even today.
Yeah, even the M on the jacket, it's almost kind of like what ended up the Nazis doing with the Jews, like putting the star on their jackets to kind of portray the same way. So it makes it sounds like they're putting the M to do it.
Yeah.
So that's probably another reason why it got banned.
I didn't even think about that part, like the M on the jacket.
Yeah.
I didn't even think about that.
So it's kind of like, so it was 3 years later that the Nazis banned it, and it did go through that way. But he could have, it could have saw the light that was coming in.
Yeah, I mean,
he kind of directed it, or made the movie that scripted it that way.
Oh yeah, I mean, the Nazis in 1931, I think they were the second largest party in the country. They were clearly on an upswing. Like, people at the time didn't know that, they were coming into power. I don't think anyone knew the extent of what would happen.
Right.
But like, they understood that like bad things were going to happen. That this was, a fascist authoritarian party that was taking control of the country. But
yeah, like I think Fritz Lang was probably very worried about that, and you can kind of see that worry in the movie. You mentioned the contrast and comparison between the police and the criminals. Because something I noticed is like the police in this movie aren't portrayed very positively, because like we see that like they're failing to catch this killer, and they're also acting a bit corrupt at the same time, because like when they raid that bar, they're there looking for the killer, but then they just arrest anyone who doesn't have their paper, like anyone who they think has committed a separate crime. And like while it's going on, it cuts back to, I think, like the police sergeant who's just like drinking from the bar, like that they're raiding, or like
and lighting up a cigarette.
He's like lighting up a cigarette, like using things at the bar while this is happening. And we also see the police lie a few times throughout the movie, like lie to people in order to get results. So there definitely isn't really someone in this movie who has like the moral high ground, the police or the criminals or the killer. Like the only true innocents in this movie are the victims and the victim's family. Because I was talking about, you mentioned the ending, like something that just occurred to me, no one really wins at the end of this movie, because the mom, Elsie's mom, says this won't bring back our kids, because the film ends without us even really finding out what happens to the killer. No. Is he sentenced to death? Is he put in a mental asylum? We don't really find out. And all the criminals, I assume like the ones who were holding the trial were all arrested, like probably for interfering in a police investigation. So
and a giant robbery that they just did.
Yeah, so they are probably all arrested. The killer, he is either sentenced to death or arrested. And yes, the police have done their job, but at this point they've allowed, I believe it's 10 children to die. So they didn't prevented any of these previous murders. So kind of is at the end, no one has really won at the end.
No, and the big message I know that he was trying to do in the movie was to kind of like have people like pay attention to your kids, like watch your kids. But just with everything involved with the movie, you took so much more out of it. And I think just the way history went, this movie just went in so many ways ethically to really look at stuff. And then never mind like technical shooting wise and cinema wise, it did a lot more. But like just the story itself, besides it going through history, like his story of this telling and just showing how people can just turn and how people's judgment can't align if it has a certain protagonist or a certain target. But like the overall story was just like pay attention to your kids, like focus on your kids kind of thing, and how this movie has like so much more coming out of it.
Yeah, and I think another building off that whole ambiguity aspect is the killer has his whole speech at the end that he's compelled to do this, he doesn't have the choice to do this, and the question of like whether someone like that deserves a death penalty or not. I think it's also up for debate. Maybe this was the intention of the filmmaker, maybe not, but it's up for debate whether that's true. Because, like, in my opinion, in my, read of the movie, I think he's lying in that scene. I think he is in control. Because if you, in the scenes when you see him stalking the girls on the street, he seems to be very much in control in terms of, like, his performance and how Peter Lorre is acting. I read it as he's in control, and this was just his desperate excuse to kind of get out of, facing justice by these criminals.
Yeah, that's something I was wondering too, because he claims he's tortured by what he does, and he doesn't want to do what he's doing. Yet early in the film, we see him writing taunting letters to the police and the newspaper. Yeah. So that kind of contradicts his later statement that he doesn't remember anything of the crimes and that he can't control this. But also, I was thinking, because when he's just going out doing errands, he sees like this girl through a window, and he definitely seems like he's troubled by what he kind of undergoes almost like this physical, mental transformation before suddenly he just like stands up straight and then he starts whistling.
And that's when you cut to the silence that we were talking about earlier. Yeah. So I think that could be read in either way. That can be read as him entering his other personality or psychological state or whatever, or that could be read as just like an artistic element to show, like, to put us in the killer's mind.
Yeah, like, and then like he doesn't end up getting that girl. Her mother, like, she goes away with her mother before Peter Lorre can grab her. And then what his character does is he goes to a nearby restaurant. And then just orders a bunch of alcohol and just quickly takes the shots, which that moment made me wonder, like, is he disappointed that he didn't get the kid, or was he disgusted with himself for even trying to do that?
Yeah, or both.
Yeah, like he could be both.
It's tough at the restaurant, but like when the mother walks by with the kid, that you can tell like he got upset that his opportunity was missed. Because even like leading up to him following her, like it doesn't show the distance, but the way the camera angle's going and you see the reflection from the window, you can tell she's moving closer, and that's when the build up comes, and then it just shows the girl walking. So you don't know like how close of an opportunity was it that he could control himself not to lunge or not to go after, or was she just always that far away that he couldn't do it. So it shows that angle, like, could he control it or can he control it? Because it doesn't show like the opportunities he has.
Yeah, and I hadn't made this connection before now, but I'm kind of thinking about Twin Peaks now. Especially the movie. Have you ever seen that?
No.
Yeah, I've seen that.
Yeah, which also does a lot with the killer in the mirror kind of stuff, but that's also more the movie than the TV show is very much about how much control the killer has and the kind of questions. But interesting. It does a very similar thing where it's very vague. How much is this a split personality kind of deal? Can't control themselves, or is this just an aspect of personality that they kind of cover up that comes out, but it is a part of them and it is always there. And I think that's an interesting thing for our audience to look for as they watch this movie. Like, what do you think?
Yeah, there's a lot of movies that kind of like that are thrillers or crime movies that you don't know if it's somebody that like his mind, the criminal's mindset is always like that, or if they're battling inside. Same thing with like Psycho and
like also American Psycho.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And like it's definitely two, like some movies do it drastically extreme, so you can tell there's two different personalities, like American Psycho. But there's some movies that really like dragging. It's like, is he a killer or is he like this? And it leads him to that.
Yeah, this is a movie that asks a lot of big, heavy questions, but then it doesn't really provide any of the answers for it. It challenges the audience, those who see it, to answer the questions themselves. And like there's definitely like back in the day, especially in Hollywood, there were a lot of films that would give you like, okay, here's the question and here's the answer. But this film doesn't give you any of the answers because there are no easy answers to any of the questions it's asking.
No, and it was definitely early development, like screenwriting. Like,
Yeah, and
there wasn't really like nowadays that you could write like a good script to explain or stop making like series of movies to explain something.
Yeah. It's not like Psycho, which, I mean, I love Psycho, almost a perfect movie except for the 5-minute scene at the end where they just have a psychologist look into the camera and tell you exactly what was wrong with Norman Bates for like 5 minutes. It's like, no, we got it. We don't need to know.
Yeah, like speaking of like American films, like there's a story that like after premiered in America, like the executive of MGM Studio, Irving Thalberg, I hope I'm saying that right, like called in all of his writers and directors to see the movie, and then told them like, we need to start making movies like this. And then but then he would admit that if someone had come up to him and basically pitched the same movie as M, he would have rejected it.
Yeah, and most times it's kind of like that. It's whatever the studio thinks sounds right, or they get their kind of image of how a movie makes. It's kind of tough. You really need somebody on the inside to like kind of pitch your story or kind of help you along to get like a lot of movies made.
Yeah, because when was the Hays Code? Was that
1934, I believe, was the Hays Code.
Yeah, so this was technically pre-code. They didn't have the because Hays Code was a law, right? That was a legal thing, or was it self-imposed by the studios?
I believe it was a law. Yeah, like the Hays Code, for those who don't know, was a law passed in America, Hollywood, like 1934, I believe, which basically limited what they could show and couldn't show. Like they couldn't really glorify drinking, criminality, or gambling. and there always kind of had to be a happy ending.
Yep, bad guy can't win. You can't show toilets. I remember is one of the weirder ones. There's some like interesting ones. So you can't show an unmarried couple in a bed.
And you couldn't even really see a married couple in the bed. That's why there's always like the two beds.
Yeah, that was
like sitcoms.
You definitely saw that in TV shows,
Mhm.
which we'll probably get later part of radio cast. But yeah, TV shows are kind of like that same way. And I think it was more noticeable in there because TV shows were more done on a weekly. Like you saw them more frequently than a movie.
Yeah.
And a movie sometimes would just be like that one scene that they just kind of have to shoot it that way.
Yeah, and there's more control by the government in TV, obviously, because that's being broadcast on waves that are owned by the government, whereas movies were being shown in privately owned theaters and stuff. So,
yeah.
I believe
then it wasn't incorporated like it is now. The movie theaters.
Yeah, and I mean, like the ratings board now, that's not legal. That's not like a legal thing. That's completely self-imposed by the studios and like the different groups of like theater owners and stuff. Like, there's no legal censorship of film in America.
Oh no, yeah. I know what you're saying.
Anymore.
Yeah. It's just an organization that's
Mm-hmm.
yeah. They're not like cut and dry. Like once the rating is, it's like, oh no, this is the rate. So like rated R, it's like, oh no, it's like supposed to be like over 18. You should go see it, but they're not going to be at some theaters. I don't know how it is nowadays, but some theaters be like, all right, under 18, you can't go into this room, kind of thing.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I always looked old, so they never ID'd me when I would go to our movies when I was like 15.
It only happened once, and for me, it was to see the movie Scream.
That makes sense.
Yep, we were able to get the tickets, but the person at checking the tickets was like, "You're not over 18. You can't come and see this movie." Like, well, we bought the tickets, so that only happened once. But then there's always workaround. You just buy another ticket and go into the theater.
Oh yeah.
And that's how you get to see double features. Just pay for one movie. Just walk into another theater, then go into when your second movie starts.
Yeah, this is a joke. If any of the movie theaters I go to are watching this, we don't do this.
No, we don't
Never.
do this. Nowadays, they barely. Actually, nowadays you barely even see anybody. Just get your ticket on your phone.
Mm-hmm.
They scan your ticket, and then you just go walk in, and you just hop from one thing to another.
Yeah. Well, that's actually one thing that's interesting is I saw this movie in a theater before, and it's a very different experience. I think that's an interesting thing with movies is, it's nice now. We got our HD TVs. Some of us got nice sound setups. You can have a really nice home viewing experience, but there is something different to sitting in an auditorium with a group of people. Hopefully everyone shuts up and you watch the movie. And I feel like that public element, the communal viewing, does have a different experience than sitting at home and watching it. And I feel like a lot of older movies especially are not helped by watching them in your house by yourself with your cell phone. I turn off my cell phone when I watch movies. I don't know about you guys because I'm going to turn it on and look at it. So I just put it in another room off so I'm not tempted.
Yeah,
Go ahead.
Yeah, like that's how I watched the movie. It was like I actually watched it for the first time for this show, and yeah, I did just watch it on my TV at home.
Oh yeah, it's they might sometimes do screenings of it, but they're probably only in like Boston or major cities like that, and once a year.
And you saw this movie in a different way too for your class.
Yeah. When I saw it in the theater, it was in college. It was a class about like music and movies. So we watched it, without with just as we're gonna show it here, and then we saw it with a live score that a group had composed for the movie, and they performed it live during the screening. And it's interesting. Certain parts I think were improved by the music, but then they knew when not to do it. They didn't play anything in that street scene. Like when that was silent, that was still played silent, and that was very effective. But I think it kind of shows off. I think if you took the music track out of most movies, they would be terrible. It'd be
Yeah,
so boring.
I think that there's movies that you think about, oh, this is great movies and a great movie, but then you think of like the song that's with it or the music from orchestra that adds to it. And like we talked about, like him with the whistling is the same thing, setting up like with Jaws. Like every time you heard that song, you knew the shark was away, but it's that song. So a lot of times, like you take the track away and it's just a fish jumping out of water.
Just the fin.
just the fin. You just see the shark. It doesn't have a build up to it. And I think that with the whistle too, that kind of does that for this movie.
Yeah. It's this is definitely, I don't know how you guys feel. This was my fourth time watching it. And I think it's probably one of my favorites from this time period. It's my favorite from the director from Lang. Metropolis is cool, but it drags a little bit. It's really too long.
I think nowadays this movie had scenes that did drag, but if you think about like how the movies were back then, it's definitely showing with the whistling and the dialogue that you can actually hear, and the shots was definitely like one of the best from that time period.
Yeah, and I just think that go into this movie with an open mind. I think there's a lot of scenes that still hold up. The opening scene, I think, is still great. The closing scene, that trial, is great. Apparently, a lot of those extras were actual criminals, and there were cops waiting outside the set to arrest a bunch of them.
I know he put it in the local paper to get people for the movie and gets the cast. So I knew that. But yeah, that's probably
Well, he claimed that he was known to also be a pretty notorious liar. He had an eye patch which was completely fake. It would change eyes.
Like I've already heard his eye in like World War One.
That was a lie.
Oh.
He was a notorious liar. He was a bad guy. He liked to abuse his actors. He lied. He was but funny guy.
Speaking of those criminals, like I think he would claim that like during the course of filming, like 24 of the extras would be arrested during the production because they just hired criminals off the street to just be like background people for that trial scene. Yeah.
Did we ever find out why it just went to public domain? Was there a reason, or just never?
I think it was always of kind of questionable control because it had been censored in its home country.
Yeah, until the 60s.
Yeah, until the 60s, and it hadn't really been played. So I think it was just there was no one around to like copyright it, because Fritz Lang, I believe, died in either the late 50s or the early 60s. And I don't think he had much of an estate, so I think it just kind of, there was no one there to copyright it, so it just went out.
I might be wrong, but I think it's still copyrighted in Germany or in Europe, but it's in the public domain here in America because
I believe so.
Because just according to like American copyright laws, like the copyright for the movie just ran out after Fritz Lang passed away and no one re-upped it. So like that's how it entered the public domain. But I think there's like some versions of the movie that are copyrighted because I think there's like a restored version of it where they do add music to it and like some sound effects, and like that version's copyrighted.
Yeah, yes it is, and there's certain other cuts that like played in Britain earlier on that versions. I think are different cuts of like time. They're different lengths and they have different stuff. I don't know. I to me, don't add stuff if you're adapting an old movie. Like if it has flaws, show them. It's view it as an actual historical document instead of trying to perfect something.
Yeah. But yeah, definitely a good first movie for us to start off and start bringing the show back on. So it's definitely hope everybody enjoyed watching it. Definitely something that you can foresee different techniques in that being used in the film. So hope we're going to wrap things up now, but this is the first radio cast. We're going to keep on doing it every week, depending on what show's coming up. So just keep on a lookout. When you watch the movie or the TV show, you can find us back here, and we'll go deep and cut with what we show. So thank you for joining on this first episode of the radio cast. Make sure you look for old time movie and old time TV shows to find out what we're going to talk about next. Have a good night, folks.